Hello and welcome to channel number 6 Vidik. We are offering a course on human rights, international humanitarian and refugee law. Under this paper, we have interviewed Dr. Christian Moliner, who studies migration and mobility. Migration and mobility is an interdisciplinary subject which is important for students studying different disciplines of knowledge, whether it is students of law or it is the students of history, journalism and mass communication or any discipline of social sciences. Enjoy this conversation. Hello and welcome. Today we are going to talk about migration and mobility. As we all know that a lot of people across the globe are all the time on the move. Approximately 4% of the population is considered to be on the move from one country to another country. As a result, migration studies have become really important. So today we have Dr. Christine Moliner with us. She is working as Director of Migration and Mobility Studies in OP Jindal Global University. Welcome to EMRC studio, Dr. Christine.
Thank you so much.
So first of all, just can you just give us the background how migration studies have grown as a subfield of sociology?
Right. So initially, if you look at the history of migration studies, it started approximately in the 1920s, 30s in the US. And it's a product of mass migration to the US across the 19th century, initially coming from Europe, afterwards coming from Asia, South America. And it is a product of an eagerness on the part of the country and its administration, its state authorities to try and make sense of that phenomenon and make sense of the impact of mass migration would have on the country. So from the very beginning, what is striking with the field of migration studies is that it is dominated by the perspective of the destination country, and it is dominated by a perspective from the state. So it's initially very much a policy-oriented field, and later on, particularly anthropologists have developed another perspective that tends to address migration from the point of view of the migrants themselves, so a human approach of migration, or looking at migration from the lens of the migrant experience itself.
So if we talk about the Europe experience, is it still destination oriented studies or we have some kind of difference from the earlier?
So broadly speaking, if you look at the field in general, whether research is conducted in Europe, whether it is conducted in the US, so in the global north, let's say, it's still very much a global north centric type of social field, social research field. And the global south, which is an area of origin of those migration flows, global migration flows, is still to develop its own tools, its own methodologies, and its own research, trying to understand the impact of migration, not anymore on the country of destination, but on the country of origin. So this is yet to happen.
Okay, so just let me take you a bit back. When we talk about migration, particularly about international migration, a person from one country is going to migrate to another country. That will bring immigration laws, visa norms into the account. That very idea of visa norms, and other entry points, etc. These are all legal points where the destination country is important. Doesn't it mean that the destination country by default is going to be the center of studies?
You are quite right, Daljit, and this is probably one of the issues with a policy-oriented migration research. I argue that it also needs to take into account the point of view of mobile people, not just the point of view of the state. But if you allow me to little bit elaborate about the link between migration, law, legality or illegality, I think it is important first to talk about terminology, because terminology, I mean the categories and the terms we use are extremely important in general, but even more important in the context of migration, which has become a highly politicized topic, particularly in the destination countries. So many scholars like me, along with activists, prefer not to use the term of illegal migration, because the term illegal tends to stigmatize migrants, and instead of talking about illegal migrants, we prefer the term of undocumented, because undocumented is a more neutral term. Nonetheless, we need to study illegality, so the concept and the notion of illegality, but we approach illegality not as a given or not something as a natural category, but something that is constructed. So I will argue that illegality in the context of migration from the global south to the global north is a category or is a notion that is imposed and that is constructed, is a legal and political category that is imposed and constructed by the state in the destination country, and that needs to be approached as such, that needs to be studied as a construction, not something that is natural.
How do that construction or that very nomenclature that so and so is illegal change when you call the same person undocumented? So the document in itself is a creation of state. So just elaborate on that point.
So basically this is now taken for granted that migrants need visas, passports, documents, papers to migrate. This was not always the case in the history of humankind. And to make sense of that illegality, that construction of illegality by the state of in the country of destination, I think we need to understand how illegality has become the major lens through which the state in the global north, so the state in the country of destination, has come to see labor migration from the global south. And to enlighten that process, I need to go back a little bit in time, so starting briefly with the 19th century. So 19th century is the century of when migration becomes a mass phenomenon. It is also the period when migration, so at that time, if you remember, it's mostly European migration to the US, but also colonial migration. For example, millions of Indians have migrated as indentured laborers in the British colonial empire. So in the 19th century, migration is both becoming a mass phenomenon and is also becoming politicized because of the emergence of the nation state in Europe. And if you look at France, nonetheless, at that time, migration in France and Europe in general, although I argue that it is becoming a mass phenomenon earlier and it is becoming politicized, nonetheless, if we go to the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, from the 1950s, so the post-World War period till the 70s, the main way to look at migration, so the main way the state in the country of destination is looking at labor migrants is through an economic approach. So the migrant is just a worker and is only legitimacy to be in France, in UK, elsewhere in Europe the work he does is labor force, And this will remain the case till the 1970s. So what happens in the 1970s is we have a complete shift in the nature of migration. Till the 1970s, as I said, migration was mostly understood in economic terms. And as far as nature of migration is concerned in Europe, whether we look at the UK or Germany or France, we have a temporary migration comprised of men, young men, who see themselves also as temporary settlers. They will work in, at that time they work in the, mostly in the industrial sector, in the mines, in the automobile industry, in the heavy industries. And they perceive themselves, and they are perceived by the country of destination as a temporary phenomenon. So labor migration then is considered as temporary. And what changed in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s is a major shift in the nature of that immigration. From a temporary, entirely male-dominated phenomenon, it becomes a permanent phenomenon. So migration becomes permanent, and this happens with the reunification of family members. So the complete shift in the nature of migration is also accompanied by the heightened politicization of migration, intense political debates and conversations and controversies, particularly in the UK and in France, about the place of migration, the role that immigrants are expected to play in their country of destination, and increasingly the framing of migration as a problem, which it was not before, because migration and immigrants were there to fill labor needs.
Okay, so I'll take you just a bit back. If we go to 1950s or late 40s, that is a major shift is happening across the globe as there are a lot of countries becoming independent after long colonial rule. So during the colonial period, the migration was managed by the state, whether it is indentured labor or it is army recruited from the colonized countries. But thereafter the migration is entirely different. First of all, there are a lot of people migrating from erstwhile colonized countries to the colonial powers, which now they are no more colonial power. And the very phase, that is post-colonial phase, completes in next, say, 20 years, from temporary labor to, as you call
permanent.
that now, the permanent, and they can ask their families to join them over there. So if we revisit this process, the process of 20 years with the reference of colonialism, does it make some change?
So the colonial heritage is extremely important in understanding not only immigration policies, not only how labor migration has been increasingly constructed as illegal, so has been illegalized by the state in let's focus in Europe, but something we have to take into account in trying to understand this political construction of illegality, of illegal immigration, is the role played by the European construction. So I think it's probably more salient an issue than as salient as colonialism. So if you allow me to discuss that right now. So what we have is a European construction from the Rome Treaty in 1957 onwards, allowing progressive dismantling of internal borders of Europe, okay, which meant free movement of people within those internal borders. So a parallel movement, on one side the dismantling of internal borders and free movement of labor within those borders, and at the same time also a strengthening of border regime of external borders of Europe, and the construction of unwanted migration, non-European migrants, mostly from the global south, labor migrants, becoming increasingly perceived as unwanted, and border regimes and policies being developed to stop them from entering Europe. So this process of European integration, European construction has been instrumental in constructing.
When you are talking about Europe, it means Western Europe, not Eastern Europe.
Yes, I mean, as you know, right now.
At that time, it was huge difference.
At that time, it was only Western Europe. Indeed.
Okay. So they were discriminating against the Eastern Europeans as well as they were discriminating against Africans, Asians, or people from.
Initially, it is interesting when you look at the UK and France, because of the colonial legacy, the migrants from former colonized countries were actually privileged in their access to. They have a right of entry usually. And settlement in Europe, in UK and France, till the 1970s. This changed afterwards, and European migrants, such as migrants coming from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, were actually having less facilitated, where their migration was more difficult than ex-colonial migrants. So there was a strong differentiation at the time between ex-colonial migrants, immigrants, and non-colonial migrants, such as Southern Europeans or Eastern Europeans. But that differentiation has been reversed, and now, as a process, as a result of this European construction, non-Europeans are constructed as, or are perceived as unwanted, and European identity, as it has evolved, has increasingly been constructed against non-European migrants, whether they are from former colonized countries or not.
But one of the arguments which has been put forward by a lot of politicians and some scholars as well, that if you are a rich person, you are all the time welcome to invest. If you are pursuing higher studies and you have money to spend, then you are all the time welcome to come there. And if you are a professional, doctor, engineer who can serve the destination country better than you are welcome. So it means there is a distinction. It is not a blanket thing that Europeans say that non-Europeans are welcome.
Sure. But this notion of distinguishing between different categories of migrants according to their educational level or their skills or their income is relatively recent in Europe. And let's not forget that.
Not just income, but the skill set as well.
The skill set and the education. And so this is relatively recent in Europe. And let's not forget that till very recently, the mass of migrants were labor migrants, many of them coming from ex-colonized countries, from the global south. And on the basis of that differentiation, it's not just a matter of who is in and who is out, it's a matter of which set of rights you are entitled to. So while this European construction process was happening, only those who would be considered as insiders, so Europeans, would be entitled to free mobility, and the others, non-Europeans, were not entitled to the same set of rights to mobility, rights to basic human rights, and furthermore, they would increasingly be framed as illegal migrants. So this concern about irregular migration, we call it irregular migration, but in policy terms, it's illegal migration. This we can even call it this obsession with illegal migration, has emerged in Europe at the same time as the European construction process.
Can you explain this obsession you talked about?
It's as if it's as if Europe had become a fortress. That external borders were there to protect from unwarranted migration from the global south. And if I can maybe elaborate on that, it's not just a matter of political instrumentalization of migration. As you know, this anti-immigrant narrative has moved from the fringe of the far right to the center of the political stage, so it has become pretty normalized, but I would contend that it is also serving a purpose, probably socio-economic purpose, because this focus, or we can call it obsession, about so-called illegal migration, undocumented migration, is also a tool that is used by the state in Europe and more globally speaking in the destination countries as a tool to create a huge reserve of very cheap labor, cheap, docile and very precarious labor that will be forced to take those 3Ds jobs, so the 3Ds for demeaning, dirty, dangerous jobs that the national labor force has for long refused to take. So this is serving political purposes to frame migration as illegal, unwanted, even as a threat, as a security threat. This serves as political purpose, but also an economic purpose.
I would just like to bring another figure into the discussion. That is the importance of refugee in the migration story as a whole. There are a lot of people who are migrating from war-torn countries, whether it is Syria or different countries in Africa. And then there is a lot of pressure on the destination countries. How many refugees they can take and how many they want to take and how many are seeking. So the asylum seekers, the refugees, do they complicate the story further?
So basically, when we talk, that brings us back to where we started, the importance of categories of terminology. Because there has been...
or do you want to discuss the whole migration as a labor migration?
So from a legal point of view, there is a clear difference, a very marked difference between asylum seekers, refugees and labor migrants, right? Yeah. And with it goes a very different set of rights. With it goes a very different way of looking at them, either by the state, by the society of a destination, and so on. So what we have observed in Europe, particularly after or during and after the 2015 so-called refugee crisis, we have observed a process of increasing delegitimization, social and political delegitimization of labor migrants that were not seen as such before. I told you they were seen in economic terms, and it was not perceived as bad to be an economic migrant. It was perceived as actually legitimate to leave your country of origin and move and contribute to the economic growth of your country of destination, to contribute to the betterment of your family situation, education of your children. There was no stigma attached to it. Okay, so again, economic migration versus what is now becoming increasingly the good migrants, namely the refugees that are also termed as political migrants. So the problem with those categories is that they are usually instrumentalized. They are also they tend to be disconnected from reality, because I would argue that those who are categorized as economic migrants, so if you look at France, for example, there are many so-called economic migrants from Western Africa and Northern Africa, and their migration, their motivations to migrate is equally political. It can be related to conflict, but it can also be related to very bad governance. It can be related to the legacy of colonialism. So I think that is political. But it will be definitely treated as economic migration and hence illegalized, delegitimized and criminalized. So it makes a big difference, although it doesn't correspond on the ground to very different experiences of migration, but in the destination countries, these different motivations and type of migration are treated extremely differently.
Okay, so you have focused in your studies of Punjabis going to France. How do you locate Punjabis in this kind of situation?
Right. So Punjabis, maybe to discuss with you about this wave of migration to France, I need to go back to the late 70s, early 80s, when the very first Punjabis who we are talking about is Punjabis. Most of them are Sikhs, very few Hindus among them. So the first wave of Punjabi migration to France took place at that period, late 70s, early 80s, and it is directly related. It is a direct product of them being denied entry to the UK. Okay, so that's when we see how immigration policies in Europe are completely interconnected and can shape migration trajectories of migrants. So the initial...
do you mean that the people who were trying to enter UK, they couldn't? They couldn't.
They were denied entry.
France was their second destination.
Exactly. So they unable to reach
Can
the
we
UK.
call that Germany, Italy,
yes.
and France?
Yes.
It was a
Belgium.
club of Belgium. They were the second destinations.
Exactly. They were not at all the preferred destination. They were by default the place where they settled. And those early migrants, all of them men, young migrants from East Punjab, arrived in France in a country where there is no colonial past, so no familiarity at all with the language, with the society, and they encountered a lot of difficulties, precariousness in jobs, in accommodation. And what actually changed, and most of them were undocumented, because what is important in migration from South Asia to Europe and generally speaking to overseas migration from South Asia, we tend to think that irregular migration is a recent phenomenon. It is not at all. It's actually very old. There were already some forms of irregular migration or undocumented migration during the colonial period, because, as I said earlier, irregular or illegality is a product of the state, is a construct of the state.
But earlier the borders were too porous.
They were much more porous.
Undocumented migration is supposed to happen when the border is porous. It means you don't need document.
But at that time,
if you don't need document, then you will remain undocumented.
Right. But at that time, you nonetheless, even if the borders were porous, and if Indians, if we talk about colonial migration, if Indians migrated within the colonial framework, nonetheless, they needed a passport, right? Particularly after Second World War, there was a need of a passport, there was a need of a visa. So the undocumented aspect of their migration was not so much when they reached UK, because that was the prime destination, but it was to obtain a passport. So I read, and it has been well documented, that Indians at the time, and we are talking about either Punjabis or Gujaratis, who were the main groups, regional groups who migrated to the UK in the 1950s, it was very difficult in some cases to obtain a passport for Indians. So what they did, what East Punjabis did, they actually procured a fake Pakistani passport. Apparently, Pakistani passports were easier to procure. So what I'm trying to say is that irregularity is not a new phenomenon. So to go back to those early Sikh settlers in France, early Sikh migrants in France, they were most of them undocumented. And what changed in their situation was the regularization procedure, massive regularization procedure implemented by the newly elected left-wing government in 1981 that regularized 1.8 lakh migrants at the time, most of them from Northern Africa and West Africa, but a few of them from Punjab. So that's the first stage of Punjabi migration. That's the first wave of Punjabi migration. After that, you have the usual process of settlement that includes sponsoring their wives and children, the emergence of a second generation. You also have in post-1984, the political migration wave. And what happens is that those different waves of migration, let's say from the late 1970s till the early 2000s, they all encountered some form of undocumented entry, undocumented stay, undocumented work. but they all find a way out of it. What changes in the experience of immigrants from Punjab and from South Asia in general, in France, since I'm talking about France, but we could generalize about the experience of Europe, is that now most of the legal ways to settle down and to obtain papers are closed. So I have encountered, and that's something I wanted to discuss now, I have encountered men in situations of long-term undocumentedness. And to borrow a phrase coined by a Pakistani anthropologist of Pakistani origin who studied Pakistani irregular migration to UK and Italy, he calls it ontological insecurity. So they are stuck in that situation of deep insecurity, deep precariousness, with very little hope out of it. And this is probably unprecedented because, as I said earlier, earlier waves of migration did experience illegality in one form or the other, but they managed to come out of it, to find a way to come out of it and get settled, permanent, and so on and so forth. Now we have hundreds of thousands of young men either attempting to migrate on the donkey route or already settled in continental Europe and trapped in a state of ontological insecurity because of the illegality imposed by the state in the destination country.
So I'll come back to you. We have discussed an important aspect of the migration studies, that is understanding the migration from the perspective of the country of destination. In the next episode, we are going to discuss the other side of the same coin, that is perspective of the country of origin. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode. We will wait for you to join in the next episode.